What we have seen so far in ASP.NET side is that uh, the server-side development that we were doing so far, it was mostly using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The server itself did not have any dynamic behavior to it. With MVC, we are changing that. Then we see we are going to write more of server-side code, and that server-side code is going to generate an HTML that is going to get transferred to the client device. It could be a computer, it could be a cell phone. Then they'll be hitting a URL, uh, and then that URL is going to get catered to using IIS or any other web server. With .NET Core, we have multiple options of selecting from the server type that we want. One option is a Kestrel server. We saw how to have these configured using the launch settings.json file, and on the .NET side, we saw at least two types of project. One is the web application project, a pages project which generates razor pages, and the second is the MVC project, which is going to generate the model view and controller, those three folders. The difference between those two is razor pages, they are going to be they all will sit inside a folder called pages, and they all have the razor page is defined the CSS_HTML file. A razor page is a combination of HTML and C# syntax. With @ you can switch from HTML to C#, and the engine itself is a little smart. It can figure out when we are in the C# part. It will execute that. It is going to replace that content with plain HTML, and it is going to generate the HTML, the UI for that, and that UI is going to get transferred across the wire. Then we added support for databases through the same logic that we used when we were working on Entity Framework core, and with the right services added and mapped, we were able to link our MVC application to a database and extract values from the database. Then we established that the controller itself is a mediator pattern, and the job of controller is to take away the data retrieval logic or the domain access from the view itself. The controller is going to be the mediator, and all the requests that we send from the browser, they will instantiate a controller. The controller is going to do the data extraction, and when the data is available, it is going to call a view, and the view itself is going to process that data to generate the rest of the HTML. Right? View is not restricted by only the HTML. A view can be a PDF file or an audio file or a video file. Then we saw what these HTTP headers are. We saw two implementations of the create option and the create action and the edit action. The create action had one overload without any attributes defined on it, which was generating the UI without any input field populated. The create action modified with HTTP post attribute, it was the post action. It would receive data from the client side from the form element, and it will populate all the elements. With those populated, we were using the Entity Framework core. We were able to inject or insert the data into the database. So we saw that, and then we ended our session with a short discussion on middleware. .NET Core, ASP.NET MVC Core, it works on the middleware framework, and you have an option of adding these middleware. The order of these middleware is extremely important. We wrote a custom middleware as well that we injected into this pipeline. These middleware, they receive a request, and on the request context, they are going to apply some form of processing. And when they are done with their part, they can either short circuit, which means that it is going to return the response from that point onwards, or it can pass it on to the next middleware in the chain. right? This flow, this composition is very important when you want to add support for multiple operations, and you also want to honor the solid principle. You don't want one function, one class to take care of all the activities. These actions could be authentication, exception handling, logging, returning static files, which is CSS and JavaScript, and the default content of the application, all the publicly accessible content. You can do exception handling, and the order of this middleware is going to dictate what things happen first and what things happen later in the queue. Exception handling is very tricky and very essential for a web application, and that's why exception handling is generally the first middleware that you're going to add. And then with exception handling added, you will always have an option of controlling things that can go wrong inside your application. So with that, let's jump to our today's topic. We're going to I can go deeper into talking about MVC itself, but then MVC is a UI focused technology, right? And there are other topics that we have planned for this course, where we're going to talk about Angular and React. They are also UI development techniques. And I don't want to teach you multiple UI development platforms. Because Angular and React are so popular and so powerful, we are going to table our discussion for UI development itself and switch to other MVC aspects. So the topic for today is going to be API development, and to understand APIs, uh, we are going to write a simple application, and we are going to constantly draw parallel between what we saw in our MVC application with the API application. So I'm going to let me pull up a project. All right. So in the last session, we worked on this MVC application. For the university app, we saw the startup class where we added all the dependencies. We added a model project which is going to take care of, which is going to store the model classes. Then I showed you example of how to take away the service bindings, the service through this extension method. In the program file, what we are doing is we are building the host builder. This host is going to initialize the web dependencies. Then in the controllers folder, we had one controller by default, the home controller. We went ahead and added another controller, which is going to take care of the student interaction. So this controller inherits from the controller class. When we added support for entity framework core, we added this context class, and through index and details, we interacted with the database. So this was our MVC application. Now let's switch gears and create a WebAPI project. I'm going to go to File, New Project. And I have this in my recent project template, but if you want to find it, you can simply type WebAPI here and then carefully choose ASP.NET Core WebAPI with the C# option. And I'm going to hit next. I have an option of picking up the name. I'm going to call it WebAPI demo. I'm going to leave all the other option as is. Hit the next button, and I'm going to choose a framework as .NET 5. Authentication, I don't care about authentication at the moment, but we have option of the identity platform and Windows. I'm going to leave it none. I'll leave the option of configuring it for HTTPS. We are not going to do Docker for a couple of weeks, and in the end, we have an option of enable open API support. I'm going to leave this checked and hit the create button. Alright, so looks like this already exists. So let's go back. And I'm going to change this to C drive code slash. All right, so let's do some comparison of the WebAPI project. I'm going to close this and let's focus on the solution explorer first. The folder structure is pretty much the same. We see dependencies, properties, then there's one folder called controller. We don't have two folders here, one for model and the second one for views. So if I can go back to our MVC web application project, we see that there's controller. There's no www root folder as well. Middleware was something that we added, but then models and views, they were already created when we created the project the first time. We have app settings, program, and startup.cs. So app settings, program, and startup.cs is present, and then there is an extra file that we see, which is weather forecast. Let's double click on this and see what we have. So if you remember from the enterprise pattern session, this is a DTO, a data transfer object, or in C# terminologies, it's a POCO, plain old CLR object. This object has no special functionality. It is just a data type with a couple of fields in it. Looks like it is going to give you temperature in Celsius, Fahrenheit, and a summary of the weather report. Let's go inside the controller folder and take a look at what we have. So we see a controller class, weather forecast controller, and it is modified with two attributes. The first is API controller, and the second is the route attribute. Let's jump back to the web application project and pick up the home controller. So the home controller wasn't modified with any attribute, right? It was inheriting from the controller class as well. And if we look at the inheritance hierarchy here, it is the controller base class in the API project. So let's go ahead and look at the definition of these two base classes. So I've hit F12 and what I see is that it's an abstract class. Let's read through the definition. A base class for an MVC controller without view support. Right? So it is very specifically saying that the class that is going to inherit from this class is not going to have view support in it. Make sense? Let's see what else we have here. We have the response object, the request object, the HTTP context, and something for claim if you want to do some form of authentication, then route data, and a bunch of other actions. Right? Let's compare and contrast with this controller class. So if I hit F12 on this controller now, right, what I notice is that the controller itself is inheriting from controller base. Now, controller base provides MVC controller without view support, but then controller, it is going to add view support, right? MVC controller with view support. So this is difference number one. A web API project is not going to have view. If you want to create an API, you're going to inherit from controller base. If you want to create MVC project, you want view support, you're going to inherit from the controller class. Let's look at the differences. The only functions that we see here, like most of them, they are related to the view, partial view, view, and view component. We only saw the view overload, but then partial view is something that you put in the shared folder. Excuse me, something that you put in the shared folder, right? And then your partial views, they're going to sit here. You can probably put it in a separate folder as well. A view component is an advanced concept of MVC web applications, and it is used when you have a repeat of functionality. So a shopping cart, a navigation bar, something that you would want to apply on multiple pages, you create those through view components. An advanced topic, you can read about it on the documentation. Then there are a couple of other actions. It returns a JSON result, and yep, that's pretty much it. So most of the interaction that we are seeing, most of the members that we are seeing in the controller class, they deal with UI. And for passing data from the C# code into the view, there are multiple options. There's something called as view bag, view data, and temporary data. Using these three options, you can transfer data between the controller itself and the view. So these are for exchanging data. We have used view data when we wanted to set the title of the page. Right? You can play around with these things, with these members, and try to understand how they are different than view data. Right? Moving on, we are back in the API project, and the API has a lot of methods. Like this challenge method, it is going to deal with authentication. Right? Moving on. So it has option for returning file. Remember in our discussion, we said that it is possible to return a file, a PDF, as a response. So when you want to return PDF, you're going to use one of these file overloads. Scrolling down. All right, so this is a physical file. If you want to redirect to a different page, a different action, you have options for redirection. Right? You can provide sign-in support, sign-out support. Then you find out that there is an unauthorized access. You can use this member, and there are a couple of validation options as well. So I'm going to close out this, and we're going to come back to this file. Now let's look at this attribute here, API controller. I'm going to once again hit F12, and this attribute is saying that it's a controller attribute, and it indicates that type and all the derived types are used to serve HTTP API responses. Right. Moving down, there's a route attribute, and route specifically is saying a controller. Right. The controller name itself is weather forecast. Let's look at what this controller class is doing. So there is some hard coding that we see. There is a collection of strings that is created: freezing, bracing, chilly, cool. Right? Looks like multiple weather elements. There is a logger that is created, and a logger is injected into the constructor. The logger copy is saved, and there is a method get, and there is an attribute mentioned here, HTTP get. Right? This get action is taking a random number, and from this random number it is generating object of the weather forecast class. So if I hit F12 on this, we are going to go to this DTO file that we saw in the beginning of this section. So a DTO object is created via selecting date time, we are assigning it an index. So it is going to run from 1 to 5, and it is going to assign next 5 dates to these 5 elements. The temperature is going to be a range between this, and this is going to be a random number between -20 and 55, and the summary is going to be that same number and pointing to this particular collection. So we are generating some dummy data for returning as a response. Towards the end, it is going to do toArray. ToArray is going to execute this LINQ expression that we have created, and it's going to return it. The return itself is IEnumerable. If we compare it to our web app project, go to the home controller, right? What we were returning here was an action result. If I go to the definition of action result, you can see defines a contract that represents the result of an action method. Right? Now, if we go to the definition of view, you're going to see that it is not returning an action result, but it is returning multiple things. It can return a view result, or it can return a partial view result, or it can return view component result itself. And if you follow through the definition of these, you are eventually going to see that they are all inheriting from iAction result. Right? A view result is going to have members like the status code, the view name, the model. Remember modifying our views. Let me show it to you. So we have added this attribute over here, @model. This is coming from the view object itself. The view is going to return view result, and view result has a member for the model. right? This model corresponds to this model statement over here, but then notice that it is of type object. But I've always had a feeling that it should have been a generic type, and then instead of t here, we mention something like t of model, so that we would have some type safety. But then I never understood this part. Then we have these three objects: view data, view template, and the content type itself. Right? Remember seeing content type in the HTTP headers, where we type except header and content type. Right? Those properties, those key value pair, they become part of the content type. And when we return a response from the controller, right, we are only passing it the model. The rest of the attributes, they get created kind of inside, and this is what gets passed to the Razor page, and the Razor page kind of processes it. Comparing this with the WebAPI project, we are not returning an iAction result. We are returning definitely just the data. Right? Let's go ahead and run this. Once again, we have IIS Express. I'm going to switch that. I'm going to change that. I have two options. I can select it from over here. I can go to project properties, and in the debug part, I can get rid of this profile by clicking this delete button. Or the third option for non-Windows users, it is in the properties folder, launch settings. You have an IIS Express over here. So you can get rid of this from here. Once you do that, it's going to go away and it's going to fall back to the next option available, which is Web API demo. It is going to spin up a Kestrel server. Let's look at this file a little more closely. The command name itself is set to project. The project name is Web API demo. That's why it is picking. That's where it is picking up the name from. Launch browser is set to true, so it's going to start the browser by default every time we execute this. And the launch URL itself is Swagger. We are not going to talk about Swagger for a little while. Let's change this to weather forecast, and I'm picking up this name from the controller attribute over here, right? Because our controller name is weather forecast, the route itself is going to dictate what URL we have to enter to get to these actions, right? So because it is configured for controller name, the controller name is weather forecast. It is safe for us to enter weather forecast over here, right? The application URL once again is going to be localhost 5001, and the environment variable, it is saying that it is set to development. Let's go ahead and spin up this application. The output is exactly the same as the other web applications that we have created, and the browser is going to localhost 5000 and weather forecast, and the data that it came back with, or the response of this request, is a collection of JSON object. These square brackets, they indicate a collection. Inside this collection, we have the weather forecast model, right? Remember populating date and temperature F and the summary members. So this, what we are getting back in response is pure data. Which we are populating inside this controller over here. Right, it is this collection of 5 elements. Enumerable of range is going to generate 5 numbers, and we are creating 5 objects of the weather forecast. Right, if I compare this, now I have to do multiple settings because 5001 is already taken. I'm going to switch to 8000 and 8001 and hit the start server button. Right, this is the Kestrel server running in the command prompt, and it is saying that on port 8001 just spinning up a server. Alright, because I have made this selection, the server has kind of stopped. I'll have to unselect this, and okay, and it is returning a web page. If I right click on this and go to page source, we're going to see the entire HTML. If I go to this page, right click and click on view page source, we are not going to see any of the HTML element. Right, it is a simple data that we have received. Right, there are other options that the Chrome browser is going to provide you. One important tab. So far we had been focusing on the elements tab. We have seen a little bit of console when we did some JavaScript in jQuery. In the source, the entire folder structure of the application is going to appear in the source folder, and in the network, all the network requests that are going to the server, they'll be tracked here. So if I hit refresh now, right, it is going to show this, right, and then it came back with the response time of the application. If I go to the MVC app and hit refresh here, right, it's going to show the same thing. We are going to look at this network tab more closely when we are making calls in Angular through for web APIs. But then there's a network tab that is going to show you all the requests that are flowing in the system. Right, moving on. So let's go ahead and close out of this and do some more whiteboarding. Right. So in our development journey so far, we have seen multiple technologies. Right, we started pure application development in week 3 with the C# programming language. What we what C# is, we were doing a lot of object-oriented programming. We were creating classes and interfaces, and we were writing, say, console application. We wrote cw.hello world, and we were seeing this output on the screen. Now, this was just the beginning of our programming expedition. Then we went ahead and we started writing more complex application, and then we interacted with a database using Entity Framework Core. Now, if you when you develop application like these, your application, they are running on your computer in an independent silo. These applications can be extremely helpful if you want to share it with some other person who is sitting, who has his own machine. Right? The application that you are developing, if you want to share it with this person, you have very limited options, because this has its own processor, this has its own RAM, and then it is interacting and it is running. It has its own I/O devices, right? And the execution of the code that you're writing, it is running on a single machine. To give it to somebody else, you will have to package your application and create DLLs. These DLLs can then be transferred to another person, and that person can perform the same activity that this DLL, this application was doing on your computer. The only problem is you are going to have multiple associated resources on your computer as well. So you can give the DLL, giving code is not a problem. But then how about the database that you have? One option is that you create the SQL scripts out of this, the DTL and DML that we saw, right? And they will have to provision the entire infrastructure. They'll have to set up the database at their end, and they'll have to execute these two queries at their end before they can get the data that you have. Right? It is not a very effective use of the code that you are writing, and sometimes um, because it's a different platform, we're going to run into different issues like like compatibility. You are doing C sharp development here. What if this person is more on the Java side, right? Then this DLL probably it won't integrate with Java as is. What if there's difference between the database platforms? So communicating between two entities is a little challenging when you are doing local development. So this problem is solved with getting things on the wire, and when these two systems are connected, you would want to provide some entry to this code, right, through a network to the code that you are writing, and then that communication happens with the wire. There are two technologies, like dominant technologies, which will help you do this. So a client that is or a program that is running on another machine, or for that matter on the same machine but as a different process, it can call and communicate another process or another computer and execute the code that they have written and just consume the data back. One such option is called SOAP. SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. I'd probably want to combine these two words. So a protocol is an agreed upon method. Like you have come to consensus that this is how I'm going to send the data, and once you receive the request, this is how you send the data back to me. So it's a protocol, right, for accessing objects that are pretty simple, right? So if we read it the other way around, it is going to tell us what this technology is supposed to do. It is going to give you access to the object on a different machine, and it is already agreed upon. So it's based on XML. Right? What it says is the data that you want to transfer to a different computer, if you represent it in a specific format, and it is called a SOAP packet, right? If you send it in a specific packet, I can listen to your request over the internet, and once that request arrives here, I'm going to extract out the request and the input and the headers that you are sending with it. So there are two parts to a SOAP packet. One is a SOAP header, and the second is the body. So the header itself is going to have specific information, like the application that you have built, for example, is a calculator, and then it has options like add and subtract, multiply and divide. If you want to use the add function, add is going to take, say, two parameters, 1 and 2. The header itself is going to have specific information about that. It's going to say that the method itself, that the method name is add, right? And in the body, I'm just making it up. Probably SOAP is more complex than this. But then you're going to have, say, an element for parameters. And in the parameter, you're going to have, say, parameter name. And then ID is, say, I. And the value itself is probably another attribute. Value is 1. You could have another attribute, say J, and you can pass it a different value. What SOAP proposes is that there's a specific structure to this XML document. All right, and then when you create this document, this becomes a request object, and this request object can be put on the wire over here. It is going to have all these SOAP elements that we saw, and it's going to get received at the server end. So when server receives this SOAP message, it is going to find out where this particular request is headed, and it is going to go to calculator slash add function. It's going to extract out those two parameters and execute the result of it. And once again, the SOAP response is going to have a specific format. So once again, it will have a header and it will have say instead of in the body, instead of a request, so I do not mention request there, but then in the response, we are going to create some very similar structure. We're going to have a parameter, and over here we're going to have result as say 3, right? This XML once again becomes a response object, and it is put on wire once again, and it is the client is going to receive this result, which it can process at its end and then print the result on the screen, right? The reason we would do this is there's code already written. You don't want to go through the pains of creating that same thing for yourself on your local computer. There are things that are happening on the internet, and you would want to consume those and perform the activities that you want to perform. A calculator, if it sounds like a bad example, a good example is Twitter. Right? Twitter is, there are a lot of people who are coming and contributing to Twitter, and you would want to show those tweets inside your application. Right? Your application might want to post something on Twitter, right? And then for that, Twitter has created a server, and Twitter has agreed upon the input request pattern and a response pattern as well. As long as you are passing parameters to a computer in a format that they have agreed upon, the protocol part, right? They'll honor your request, they're going to take an action, and they're going to return you the response of that action, right? In summary, you can put a post on Twitter through your command line application. Make sense? So SOAP is one mechanism of providing that type of information. The only problem with SOAP is that it is XML. It is very dictating. Um, there are specific formats that you will have to adhere to, and the consumer has very tight knowledge of the data that is being transferred. If you want to compare this to the other method name is REST. Right? Um, REST itself, it stands for representational state transfer. Right? SOAP has its own alternatives. It has its own options. You can control a lot of things when you are dealing with SOAP packet. REST is not a protocol, right? A protocol is very dictating, and it guides about how you work with it. But then REST is actually I'm looking for a word. REST is a little prescriptive. It is a prescription. It tells you that what a good application looks like. It says that when you want to share, say, the code that you have written with somebody else, there are specific activities that there are specific ways you should be tracking the information. There are specific ways you should be building those applications. And that strategy is actually around transfer of state, right? The views that you're going to generate, they are going to be about state of those objects. All right? It says that everything on the internet is a resource. And you want to provide a mechanism of accessing those resources. So the last example that we saw, it was for the weather forecast, right? The weather forecast in the REST world is a resource on the internet, and the way you're going to access that resource is you're going to come to this page and you're going to just enter the URL that it's a weather forecast, right? And then whatever is available at that location of the internet, it is going to return you that data, right? Inside a SOAP packet, we have methods like add and delete. So let me go back to the university project, and we're going to make another distinction in the controller name themselves. If you, what does that? Let me outline and okay. Now let's look at these action names more closely. The first action is index. It's a verb. Okay, it is telling you to index something and it is returning you an action result. Details is another verb. Right? Create is another verb. Create, edit, delete, and delete confirmed. A soap packet is going to be a series of words. What we have seen here in the calculator example as well is that calculator, all the members that we have, they are also verbs. Add, subtract, multiply, divide. They are all actions that we are requesting for. So a SOAP service is about actions. If you want to perform something, you are going to very specifically tell it that what method you want to get called. If you want to add, you want to subtract, and it is going to go to the server, it is going to perform the action, and it is going to come back with the result. Right? Inside REST, it is going to say that weather forecast is a noun, right? And on this noun, we are storing some information and we are requesting for that information. When we go to the WebAPI demo page and look at the URL structure, so if I execute it and bring this result back, our URL is not get weather forecast. Our URL is simply weather forecast. That there is a resource, there is a noun on the internet, it is called weather forecast. Can you perform some action on it? Okay, and that action in this case was get. Right? There are other actions that are available as part of HTTP, and it is through that action that we are going to interact with this resource on the internet. Then REST says that the responses or the resources on the internet that you have, you are going to return them, and that's how you're going to interact with these objects. Right? When we say that the service is RESTful, REST is an implementation technique, and we are combining this implementation technique with a web service. So a web service, once again, is going to run on your server. It's going to receive requests over HTTP from a client, and the response that we send, it is not in the SOAP packet. It is in the form of HTTP verbs. Now, the verbs that we have already seen is get, post, put, and delete. There were other as well, like patch and a couple other, but we have seen all these verbs already. What REST says is the information that the client wants to transfer on the internet, they are simply going to put it on the HTTP on the wire. The request is going to come to the server, and based on the verb that we are passing, we're going to take action on the data that is coming in. So let's jump back to our MVC application. We have written a middleware yesterday, and in that middleware, I've made a small modification. In the invoke function, I'm not printing hello world or inside middleware. I'm printing the method through which we are accessing the service. So let's hit F5. And notice that it is printing get, right? Because of this page launch. When I come to this page and hit the enter button, right, it is going to print another set of get here. Right, it is because of each incoming request. Now, if I hit the student button, right, you're going to see a fourth get, and then it is going to come back with a response. right? On this response, we have an option of create new. But when I do create new, it is going to print another set of gets. So let me go ahead and close out this. And just to make the example a little more relevant, we are going to print the URL as well. So request dot http context dot. Give me 1 second. I am trying to recollect the member for printing URL. Doesn't go. So very close. Context dot request dot path. I was thinking that it is URL. Let's go ahead and make it a little friendly. I'm going to type URL here, or let's stick to path. And down below, we are going to change this to the method and double quotes. Alright, so when it comes into the middleware, it is going to print the path and it is going to print the method name next to it. Hit F5, it is going to launch the Kessler server. So the server has started, the browser window has launched, right? And notice that the path itself is slash and the method is get. If I hit on the student link, it is going to the student URL with a get method. If I go to the create new, once again, it is a create path and the method once again is get. Notice that we had JavaScript added to our solution, and then that JavaScript is getting requested from the server through this URL /library/jQuery/js file all the way up to the method name itself, the get method. Right now, if I provide my name, I'm going to change it to something tricky and enroll for course number 2. Once I hit the create button, right, notice this post element. Right, remember that we had 2 implementation for create, like this. Not in the custom middleware. I want to go to the student controller, and we had 2 implementations of create. One was without any modifier, by default that is get, and the second is modified with the HTTP post attribute. When we do post, the request that the browser sends, it is actually a post request, and so this is where we are handling it. The place where we're dating it is in the views, student, the create page. It is because of this form element, it is because of this action, and it is because of this button here. Right? We have not mentioned it, but then the method name itself over here is post. Right? When we generate the UI for the create page, right, because of the selection once again, right, if I hit Control U, it's going to show me the source code, and in the form element of the page, you're going to see a method name is post. The method name from this form element from HTML is going to get translated into a post request, which is going to the server and hitting the post overload of the create action. Make sense? Let's go ahead and observe a couple of other requests as well. I'm going to go back to students and let's hit the delete option. Once I hit delete and come back to this page, it is sending a get request for a delete action, for a delete link click with this detail, delete/21, and it's a get request. Now, if I, let me unselect this. Okay. Now, if I click this delete button, the verb that is sent to the server is post, and it is not HTTP delete. Let's go ahead and see what HTTP methods we have. And one very good source of such information is the Mozilla documentation. HTTP method. If I go to this action, you're going to see that there are multiple post, put, delete, connect, option, trace, patch, right? Get, head. There are multiple verbs available, but then the MVC application that we have built, the web application, it is only getting using the get and the post method. There is a method available for delete as well, but then the delete button itself is not deleting anything. It is sending a post. With that post, it is accessing a resource and it is deleting that resource. Right, go unselect this and let's switch gears and go to the web API that we have created. I'm not a big fan of this API. I'm going to get rid of these two. I'm going to delete the controller itself, and I'm also going to delete the weather forecast. Let's go ahead and do our university project. And because we have done a lot of groundwork already, I'm taking a chance. I'm just going to add a controller, but then this time I'm not going to select an MVC controller. I want to select a WebAPI controller. Add controller, and then I'm going to select the API option over here, and I'm going to leave API controller with entity framework. I'm going to hit the add button, and all it is asking for is the model class. It is not asking for any layout controller. It is not asking for anything else. I'm going to call it university controller. I should have called it student, but then we already have a controller for student. So I'm going to call it university controller and hit the add button. Alright. So we added the university controller. Notice that it has API controller attribute assigned to it. It is inheriting from a base, which is a controller without view support. It has done most of the entity framework coding for us, created the context object, assigned the context, and the methods that we have is get students, get student, put student, and my control M control L option kind of has gone bad. Right, if I just see the outline of the code, the action is get student, and it is returning. It is modified with HTTP get, and this one is modified with HTTP get with a parameter name in it. And notice the URLs next to it. So it is API/university, API/university/5. Alright, the put student action is modified with HTTP put method. Right, there's an HTTP post method for posting something. For delete, there is a delete method. We still have the middleware in place. Let's go ahead and see if there is any modification to the startup file. I'm hoping that we are not going to have to modify any of this here. Let's just go ahead and hit the debug button, and it is going to spin up the server for us. Now, by default, it has launched the web browser. Because we are doing everything in the same project, I'm going to have to type API/student, and when I hit this, I'm so sorry, I might have to enter university here. Right. Do you notice the output now? What we've done is we have hit the get point for university, and now if you look at the middleware where we are printing the URLs, it is saying that it is hitting API/university URL, and it is doing a get. if I, all right, I don't have options of posting information. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to launch another tool called the Postman, right? Postman is a REST client or a Web API client. I'm going to close out of this, and enter the URL here like this: localhost 8000 API/university. And this time I'm going to call the get function and hit the send button. And then it is the same response that we are receiving that we saw on the browser window. And once again, in the on the server side, you're going to see APIs/university with the get keyword. Now, let's go ahead and get a little tricky with the syntax. I am going to close off from most of these tabs, and I'm going to only leave the university controller. So we already saw this method. It was modified with HTTP GET. Now, if I want to extract only a single student, I can pass slash and then pass a number to it. And if I do /5 and hit the send button, because of the selection, right, we came back with only one element. If we go back to the previous call, right, notice that this was an array starting with square brackets and then a series of JSON objects of student. But then with /5, it is not an array that we are receiving anymore. We are receiving only a single JSON object. And if we look at the result set, I am a little confused why I'm seeing action result here. I'm assuming that this action result internally is going to point to some JSON result, right? So we are still not returning a view. We are returning an action result. An action result eventually is going to convert it to a JSON object. The get student is going to return a collection, and that's why we saw those square brackets in the response. The get student, it does not have IEnumerable. It has just a student. And if you look at this element, it is the student object that we are returning. If we found something, it was, if the student was not null, we would return this. Let's see what happens when we see the not found response. But before that, let me highlight this status code here. So there is 200 OK that got printed. Now, if I know that this particular student ID doesn't exist. If I hit send, right, it is going to print a JSON message once again saying that the value this is not valid. And look at the status code. It is saying 400 bad request. Right? So the request object that came in for that particular controller, there was something wrong. So we saw example of not found and the student. Let's move on to the next action. We're gonna see put in a little in a short while. Let's take a look at the post method. So a post student is going to take the student object as input. Let's pull up the same student again. Let's populate this value, and instead of get, we are now going to switch to post. And as soon as we switch to post, the body member is enabled here. So I'm going to select and enter this. We don't have to provide the ID value. On the first name, I'm going to provide Ziaullah Khan, and course ID, because there should be some referential integrity, I'm going to say 1. And the course itself, I can probably leave this empty as well. Let's go ahead and just to demonstrate it better, I'm going to hit a breakpoint here, and we have not selected anything in the console. Now if I hit the send button, all right, something is wrong with this JSON object. That is a bad string. I have to delete this extra comma in the end. And now if I hit the send button, we see 2 post statements. I don't know why it is I didn't remove 5. So now let's remove that, and now hit the post action, and my breakpoint is not hitting. I was hoping that it's going to come and stop here. HTTP post student, the student information. I need the field first name must be a string or array of type length less than 5. Okay, so let's just change this to Z, and I'm going to hit send, and with the validated model it came here with the student information, right? Z and Khan and course is 1. Now it's going to fall through, and it is going to come in, it's going to create that resource for us. When it creates that resource, all right, the status code that we received is 201. 201 is created. 200 was okay. 201 is created. And it created a student with ID 1008. First name, last name, the course ID. In the course name itself, it did not extract that value, but then it is available as part of the response. Now, what I wanted to show, the second thing was this link here. Right? We are hitting the get and the post, but this is where things get interesting. Now, if I want to delete the same student that I just added, there you go. Right? Now, if I hit, right, so I can't post. I'll have to switch to the delete verb, and if I hit send, notice that the verb itself has changed. Right? We are deleting. We are telling through HTTP that I want to delete the resource that is present at this URL. Right? This delete, it came and it directly interacted with the university controller, the delete action. Right? It is modified with the delete verb, and if we set our method to delete and enter this URL, it is going to delete the resource at that particular link. If we hit that again, notice that it is 204 no content. The status code has changed. We are deleting the same resource that we have already deleted. Let's see what happens now. Alright, it is saying 404 not found, and the console or the server is noticing another delete command for this particular resource, and the response object is saying that it's a 404 error, that the resource that we are trying to delete on the internet, it is not present at that URL. Okay, so we can play around with all these URLs. One thing that probably I should show you is that this method name here, it does not matter. I'm just going to call it name doesn't matter. I'm hoping that it'll work. I'm going to start the server again. Let's go to /API/university. I won't do it here. I'll do it in the Postman. We have already deleted 1008. Let's delete 5. So delete URL, and once I hit send, we're going to see a delete request for ID 5, and the resource is deleted, 204 no content, and we were demonstrating that the name here doesn't matter. Right? This is not the case with the web API project that we, or the web app project that we saw. This name here matters, right? You have to match this name with this particular link. If you want to modify that, there's an option. It's called route, and inside route, you can override the action name, a new detail action name, right? Then you will have to call it with this particular action name. But then generally you don't do that, right? You would only do it in cases you want to abstract out the implementation detail from the URL. But then this is a source of confusion. I would probably avoid this. But in the web API project, the name actually don't matter, right? It is the HTTP verb that we decorate our actions with that takes effect, right? So delete is going to require an ID parameter, and we are receiving that in the method, and that's how we are binding this ID property to this ID, and we are deleting the resource. And when the delete action fails, we simply return not found, right? And when we find it, we return the no content element. So status code 204 is coming through this function. And if I hit F12 on this function, you're going to notice that there are many such there are many functions that are going to do this activity for you. I don't know if you're going to see an entire list. It is inheriting from status code result, and when you go to the implementation, you're going to find that it has multiple options. So HTTP status code is it has a whole series. So the series from 100 to 199 is informational response. Success response is the series of 200. Redirect is 300. When you move one resource to another, you return redirect. And client error is 400. So client error is very specific to the client. It is some mistake from the client end. Either they have entered the wrong URL, or they are passing the wrong parameter, or they are not authorized for that resource, right? So you're going to see 403, 404, or they have entered URL for a resource that you don't have. But then because the request is coming from their end, it is still a client error. And server error is when you don't have when you fail doing something. So an exception occurred and you don't know what to do. That's when you're going to return a series 500, right? So with that, let's take a quick break for 10 minutes. I'm going to see you at exactly 10 minutes. Thank you. So what you've seen so far is that we were building desktop focused application. We're building single machine based applications so far, and sharing these applications with somebody else gets a little tricky because they have their own platform, their own operating system. They won't have the same environment as you, and sharing code across machines is tricky. One The way to solve it is that you provide access to your code on the internet to the consumers of the application. Now, there are two ways of doing it. The first way is using SOAP. SOAP is Simple Object Access Protocol. It dictates that there should be a specific pattern, there should be a specific mechanism through which you are expressing the service that you have and the response that you're going to give. Now, for a service like a calculator, you can create an extensive document based on XML, and that document is called WSDL, which is Web Service Definition Language. And then this visual document is going to be an XML document, and this document will provide you the methods that it is exposing and the response to expose from that service. Then we saw another implementation, another method of exposing services on the internet, and that was okay. I used the wrong word. Then we saw another